Friends, my first exposure to Pokemon was in the 7th grade when I entered the first day of school and took my seat in the back of the science class. And this giant motherfucker, who must have been 27 years old at the time with a full beard and sleeve tattoos, sat next to me. My first thought was, oh great, I've met my bully for the year on the first day. Glad to get that out of the way early. See, I was a very shy, very socially anxious kid and an easy target for this mountain of a 7th grader whose own children were probably sitting a couple of rows in front of us. Kids shuffle in and take their seats, the teacher appears in the back hallway, and class gets off to, the usual first day stutters. A little time goes by and the hulking figure next to me leans over and says, "Yo." And I'm like, okay, what'll it be, harassment? Telling me to move so he's not seen sitting next to me? An invitation to do his homework for the year that I can't refuse? No. He leans over again and he says, "You want to see my Pokemon?" My 13-year-old brain takes a second to register, and I think to myself, well, that's a new one. You see, despite being a gamer on my left up to that point, I was not that well versed in Pokemon. This was 1996, 2 years before Red and Blue were released in the United States, and I wouldn't discover anime properly until a couple years later in high school. So I assumed the worst. And this student next to me, who must have been half rhinoceros, but I dare not guess which parent it was, pulled out a binder and flipped it open. It was full of bright trading cards with wild, colorful animals splashed across them, with stats and facts along the bottom halves. I soon realized that I wasn't about to become a man at the age of 13, and that this 7th grader, who probably voted in the previous 2 elections, was actually trying to make friends with me and show me something that he was both proud of and really excited for. Pokemon has always been the great equalizer and a property that has brought together people of all walks of life since its inception. And perhaps the greatest example of Pokemon's power to unite humanity was the 2016 release of Pokemon Go. Welcome back to Space Castle, where we explore all things nerdy in the universe. I'm your Captain DT, and it has been 8 years to the day since Pokemon Go was released, if you can believe that. Dropped upon the world on July 6, 2016, Pokemon Go was an augmented reality mobile game developed and released by Niantic, who collaborated with the Pokemon Company and Nintendo. The game used your mobile device's GPS to turn the world around you into the world of Pokemon, and you wandered around on foot catching Pokemon using your device's touchscreen. The game was kind of brilliant. A simple concept, but with great execution, it became an instant global hit and pop culture phenomenon. I thought it would be fun to take a look back at that summer of 2016 and reminisce about how for one short window of time, it felt like the whole world had come together to enjoy something and share in its excitement. There were a lot of detractors and naysayers and people who were too cool for school when the game was released, and all of them seemed to change their minds once they tried it. We all knew somebody like that in the summer of 2016. Leave a comment down below and call out that person who thought they were too cool for Pokemon Go and then got addicted to it. It was free to download and play with some microtransactions, including buy more Pokeballs to catch Pokemon for your collection, or to purchase lures which could be used at Pokestops to attract more Pokemon to your location for a limited time. But if you were diligent and active in the game on a regular basis, you were doing just fine on supplies. So you'd wander around your neighborhood or wherever you might be in the real world, and in-game, wild Pokemon would appear and you'd attempt to catch them using Pokeballs of various effectiveness by twirling them around on your touchscreen and swiping them towards the creatures. Landmarks in your area, including parks, fountains, statues, and more, were all implemented as landmarks in the game, notably as Pokestops, which rewarded you with more Pokeballs or fruit to feed the Pokemon to make them easier to catch. There were also gyms just a short while later where players could gather in person to attempt to defeat the player-owned Pokemon who were left there by players who had captured the gym prior. What's more is that there was a rivalry aspect to it. There were 3 different color-coded teams to choose from: the red team Valor, the blue team Mystic, and the yellow team Instinct, each one represented by one of the original legendary bird-type Pokemon from the series. Team Valor was the best one, and everybody else can suck it, especially Team Instinct, bitches. So not only was the game great for getting exercise and fresh air, it was also compelling in that it fed people's addiction to collect things and had a great competitive aspect too, with a sort of King of the Hill style competition to capture all the gyms in an area. And it set the world on absolute fire. I swear to God, it was like living in the 1950s again, where everybody was outside socializing and kids were riding bikes in packs to all the different markers in the neighborhood, and grown-ass adults had turned their walking and jogging groups into Pokemon Go teams. That summer, I was still living in Arizona, and the neighborhood absolutely came alive. Even at 100 plus degrees out after sundown, there was so many people out at all hours, meeting each other, going on adventures, catching Pokemon, and having a great time. The apartment complex I was living in at the time had two main entrances with statues on pillars on either side. It sounds fancy, but it was like $750 a month. It was really nice, but it was privately owned, so I got a ridiculous deal on it. Anyway, those entrances both ended up being Pokestops, so I was absolutely rolling in Pokeballs, lures, and fruit all the time. All I needed to do was walk like 20 feet outside my front door to go use both Pokestops. The rest of the neighborhood caught on, and suddenly my cross streets were the place to be every single day. People of all ages would walk by or stop to socialize, get some Pokeballs from the stops, and fast friends were made for wandering around the surrounding area together. It got to the point where the assistant manager of the complex decided he didn't like all the people loitering outside the property and came out to harass everyone. There must have been 10 of us, from teenagers to me in my early 30s at the time, to an older couple from the retirement condos down the street. This guy, we'll call him Mark, was a doofy piece of work with a blonde flat top, a lame mustache, and thick-ass glasses. He always wore the exact same polo shirt and tan slacks, and one night, he comes marching out of the property and tells everybody that if they don't leave, he's gonna call the cops. And we're like, no one's trespassing on the property, Mark. We're hanging outside the entrance on the sidewalk peacefully, respectfully, and we're having fun, and it's like 6:15 p.m. on a Friday. Do you want to go grab your cell phone and play some fucking Pokemon with us? But this male Karen insisted everybody must leave unless they're guests of a resident of the property. So I say, they're all my guests. These are all my guests. And Mark is like, well, fine. What are their names? And I'm like,
Maki, Ricky, Danny, Terry, Mikey, Davey, Timmy, Tommy, Joey, Robbie, Johnny, and Brian.
Mark is not a fan of this, and he just marches right back into the property, and we don't see him again for the rest of the night. We all laugh and continue on catching some fucking Pokemon. I can't overstate how much this game captured the attention of everybody in the world. Just in Arizona, in the dead of summer and 115 degrees outside, people were sweating their asses off running full speed to catch Eevees and Pidgeys. The whole rest of the world was like this too. Across the planet, it felt like the world had come together as a global community over this silly-ass mobile game. And it had actual real-world impact too. I remember reading a story just a couple of days after the game had been released about a young woman in Wyoming who discovered the body of a missing person while wandering along the highway playing Pokemon Go. A teenager playing a cell phone game was empowered by Pikachu to be more effective than the local police department. It was absolutely wild, and we haven't really seen anything like it since. Eventually, folks figured out how to exploit the game system and created websites and web apps to track the spawn points of Pokemon in the game. It was no longer about randomly discovering Pokemon out in the world, and instead you can actually open up your web browser, dial it into your location, and see which Pokemon were spawning and where. Nintendo and Niantic did not like this and were not happy at all. And you'd think that this would kill the game, taking away the mystique and making the game much too easy. It didn't. It recharged the game all over again, and now people were traveling outside their neighborhood and going on full-blown pilgrimage to catch their favorite Pokemon. In Gilbert, Arizona, there's a park called the Riparian Reserve. It's a beautiful wildlife sanctuary with multiple biomes and lakes, which is great for hiking and birdwatching. It's free to visit, too. And for whatever reason, it became the biggest spawn point for Pichus, Pikachus, and Raichus in the state. The park's popularity exploded, and it became the spot to go hiking and exploring on weekend mornings. It was literally the only reason to visit Gilbert, Arizona, unless you like meth. People found out that water types were spawning on the coasts, and people were taking actual vacations to California and Florida to catch Pokemon that weren't readily available in their own areas. One time, I was alone in the office I was working at on a slow day that summer, so I popped open the Pokemon Go app on my phone, and I pulled up one of the more reliable Pokemon radar sites on my work computer. I happened to see a Snorlax spawn on the golf course behind the building So I locked up the office, I ran to my car, I drove around the corner of the golf course, and I started running across the fucking green. When I got there, 3 other people were running to the same spot. One guy was in a full-on 3-piece business suit. We all saw each other running and we could not stop laughing. It was a good minute before we could stop giggling long enough to exchange names and cheer each other on as we each caught that Snorlax. That entire summer was just magical, probably one of my most favorite summers as an adult, in fact. So many mornings and evenings getting exercise and fresh air, so many new restaurants and breweries discovered because a grouping of Pokestops was nearby, and great memories of wandering around with family and friends, catching imaginary animals and making them fight each other for our enjoyment. If you're here, chances are you played Pokemon Go in the summer of 2016 and beyond, and I bet you have at least one great memory from it. Leave a comment down below and let's share some awesome Pokemon Go stories from back in the day. That sounded like Pokemon Ghost stories. And if you're new here and you're a fan of nerdy videos like this where we talk about movies, games, TV shows, and more, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. I'm your Captain DT, and I'm out here floating through deep space alone, and it gets really lonely, and
what am I, exactly? Chopped liver?
Jesus Christ, I forgot all about you for a little while, Goldblum.
Yes, I was just doing your taxes, and I'm afraid that all the money you're spending on Pokeballs and new hats for your Pokemon Go character are not retroactively deductible for having made this video.
Well, shit!